Good afternoon, you very punctual folks. We let you in 5 minutes early, but we will be starting promptly at 1:00 p.m. Thanks for being with us. Guess we don't have a T-Rock theme song as of yet, so I hope folks know they're in the right place. I've gone to so many meetings lately where it's sort of dead silence, so we did put some new pictures on the screen. At least we give you something else to look at. Keeping you busy with the admitting there, Shane. You're going to have a quick draw to keep everybody coming in here. 2.5 minutes to go. Almost at capacity here. We probably have almost unlimited capacity, but almost at a full roster, creeping up on 40 here. I'm sure it'll be quite a few more than that. Could have a last minute rush here at 46 with half a minute to go. Well, 3/4 of one. Thanks for being with us, folks. We will definitely be in good shape to start promptly. We have a full agenda. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome commission members, welcome members of the public and possibly the press. My name is Paul Caulfield. I'm honored to be the facilitator of today's session, along with my colleague Keith Chase, who will join us a few times throughout the presentation. We're really trying to turn the corner and make sure we're hearing more from you than from us. So I'm going to cover a couple of items. We are going to record today's session, so I think you know that's a matter of record, and I think when you sign on, they let you know that as well. I am going to cover the Zoom in case you weren't with us last time around. So for commission members who have joined and can participate with the online Zoom platform, I just want to show you how to unmute if you'll just find that section, because we'd love to hear from you. And if you want to let us see you, which many of you are doing, thank you. You click the start and then go away with a stop of your video. And if you want to change the gallery view and see everyone versus the person speaking, you can do that. If you'll click chat, that will be helpful. We'll ask you to use chat throughout the session. We will also be employing our Mentimeter, not a lot today, but we'll have it open for some of the conversation, just as an open forum. So you can pull your chat up. And as well, you can click participants to see who's here. I'll keep an eye on that because you can raise your hand if you want to participate. So that has just popped up and it looks something like that. Use those buttons shown there to raise your hand because I'd like to keep it somewhat orderly when people weigh in. And you might find the raise your hand in the reaction. There are a couple of different formats that come out from Zoom. A couple of quick items before I turn it over to your chair. The draft April 15th session, this is our third now, that was our second meeting. Those minutes have come out, the Mentimeter results, and there were a lot of them, which we grouped up, categorized. They have come out to our commission members along with a PDF of the PowerPoint presentation, the chair's email on those topic leads. I'll let her talk about that a little bit, and the meeting agenda for today. So that's right to our agenda, the objectives, just a moment, and we'll do a quick look at the schedule and hear from our chair. And then we're really going to ask some folks to offer their reflections on the 7 topical areas identified under number 4. We'll hear briefings today as well from ARTBA and on the Pell. So lots of information coming at you and from you today. We'll wrap it up. I'll reserve 10 or so minutes for public comment. Members of the public, especially those who have connected only by phone, you'll have to unmute by hitting *6, I believe, on your phone. Limit comments to 3 minutes. Other members of the public can participate through the online avenues afforded them on the platform. We appreciate that. That way we have it on record, and then we'll wrap it all up. So today we really want to frame and focus the dialogue of the commission on the key revenue opportunities. We have categorized 7 sets of possible opportunity areas. They're pretty broad categories. They are not all inclusive or exhaustive. A lot of other ideas have come to us through this process, and we really do have to sift through that and find out other avenues of revenue to explore. And the briefing. So we'll hear a bit about national practices on the MBUF, as we're now calling it among friends, the mileage-based user fees, and then the Pell, the linkages study. Talk a little bit about next steps as we head down the road of evaluation. Here we are in April. We're working on generating and evaluating options. You might note at the bottom that our May meeting dates have been set for May 13th and 27th. Commission members, the invitations are out, and I'm keeping it moving fast. So Secretary of Transportation, Yasmin Gramy, and more importantly, your commission chair. Secretary.
Thank you, Paul. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 3rd meeting of the Transportation Revenue Options Commission, or TROC. Thank you all for all your engagement during the last meeting. At our last meeting, we identified 7 revenue topics for further analysis. The intent in doing that was to continue making progress within our highly compressed schedule. We have a great deal of work to do in a short amount of time. While we need to keep moving forward in our work, there will be times where we will slow down to ensure that each commission member is operating from the same understanding. Today, we will provide some further definition and expectations as we move forward into these revenue topic discussions. Our intention for today's meeting is to begin considering some of the critical aspects for each topic, but we got enough feedback, however, to show that we need to discuss the direction and the requests in more detail. We will do that in today's meeting. Recognizing the time commitments that we are asking of all our commission members, and particularly for our legislators during this busy budget season, we will have our staff lead the analysis and discussion of each revenue option. We will collaborate with the members of each group, and since ultimately the legislature can consider the TROC report in their deliberations, we will ensure that each legislator has a full opportunity to provide advice and input across this broad range of topics without being part of a particular subgroup. Our goal is to work together, making recommendations that address Pennsylvania's transportation funding crisis that can be implemented to benefit the Commonwealth for decades to come. This is our mission as we continue to work together over the next 3 short months. We will take great care in communicating all expectations and understanding each other's expectations. We have an exciting agenda today. We will have a presentation by the American Road and Transportation Builders Association, or ARPA, to give us an overview of what other states are discussing and implementing to address transportation funding. We will also have a presentation on the draft planning and environmental linkages, or PEL study, that is being conducted as part of the PennDOT Pathways program. Thank you again for being part of this important conversation. Before we get started with the agenda, the first order of business is to approve the minutes from the last meeting. May I have a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved, Ron Drenovich.
Thank you, Ron. Do I have a second?
This is Paul.
I'm sorry, do I have a second?
Howard Cohen.
Thank you, Howard. We have a motion, we have a second. Do we have any discussions? I hear none. Is there anyone who opposes to approving the motion? I hear none. Motion approved. Now let's get started. Back to you, Paul.
Terrific. Thank you, Secretary. Thank you all. You might note that we really keep the minutes very brief. They do provide an outline of the process, but most of the information comes in the form of the question and answers that we're going to try to stay on top of and provide, and of course the other information that comes out. So just as we prepare for our discussion of those major categories, just want to put a couple of things in perspective, and it's probably very clear to many of us here, but it probably bears repeating, or at least kind of taking another look at when you look at the highway funding. So we are not dealing here with the multimodal, but just to take a subset of the overall revenue sources. You look at the motor license fund, right? So you're really talking highway transportation here. When you look at the total of that, the liquid fuels comes out to on the order of 80%, roughly 78%, at some $3 billion plus of the $4.1 billion. We thought it would be helpful to just kind of put that in perspective. And another way to consider that is, where is that relative on a proportional basis? Where is that relative to some of the other states touching or very close to touching Pennsylvania? We dropped these in descending order, and there's a lot of difficulty in making these comparisons, but as well as could be put together, what it looks like is Pennsylvania is the leader in terms of, if you will, reliance on the gas tax, the liquid fuels tax as a proportion of its state highway funding. Much smaller state, West Virginia, is next in line. You don't need me to read these to you, but you'll see obviously quite a decrease as you run down all the way to New York, another large state, at some 18%. So we wanted to just kind of drop that in there. We can provide the background for that. This was actually included in some of the material that came out, I think, very early in the game as T-Rock started to come together. But it's a kind of backdrop for the discussion we want to have, because we've talked about funding gaps, and built into that is, well, there are revenues coming in and then there's a gap, but even those revenues coming in, we cannot be 100% confident will be there with fuel efficiency of vehicles or non-reliance whatsoever on liquid fuels and so forth, both commercial and passenger vehicles.
Paul, can I interrupt with just a question?
Indeed.
Briefly, and maybe you can't do it off the top of your head, but where did Delaware and New York get their alternative tax revenues, if not from the fuel tax? And, you know, it's rather
well,
glaring
yeah,
difference between us and New York.
Right. and I probably can't do that off the top of my head, but I know where that data is. But what I can offer is a collection of other major contributors. So I can't tell you right on the spot where Delaware gets its other revenues. Maybe one of the folks from the department can help us with that.
Maybe
But the
we can
other,
just provide that,
Oh, sure.
as we go forward. Thank you.
Sure. Oh,
Sorry for
great
the interruption.
question. No worries. And you really queued up this next slide because all of those other states have other areas of contribution, a big one being corporate income tax. And then you have the sin taxes. That's why we have a picture of a casino on here, including tobacco and so forth in some of the places. Tolling revenues are a piece. There are specific dedicated sales and use taxes for highway. And then while we have, of course, vehicle registration fees, some of them are significantly higher. And when you talk about that many vehicles and making a change in that, there's a pretty big effect on the budget. So noted that we will definitely get that out, the background that helped build those slides for us. Thank you. So April 15th, lots of input. We thank you very much. I'm going to move right on to the big areas of opportunity for revenue. And we classified them in this way: multimodal, mileage base, so MBUF, those vehicle registration fees just mentioned, tolling and taxing scenarios, local solutions, and that doesn't exactly say where that revenue is coming from, but we want to start to explore where it might be coming from. And something that would be very familiar are accelerated state police funding reduction. We did our best to sort of pick a few folks and ask them to reflect on these things. There was a very tight timetable. By the time they got the notice, it was probably within a week of this meeting. So we did not impose a lot of structure or order. Perhaps they might have liked us to do so, and I apologize for that. But the real approach was to ask people to think a little bit about this. And then as we move forward, if these have staying power, if there's worthwhile investigation to be done here, the effort will continue, and some of those folks may really help to pull others together. So think about where you might be able to make a contribution, be it one or perhaps many of the options provided here. So with that, I just want to take you to chat for a moment. I've placed the Mentimeter link in chat. You do not have to enter anything whatsoever in Mentimeter, but if you do click on that link, it should take you with your browser to the Mentimeter, and that should skip your need to put in any kind of, oh, no, not seeing it in the chat. Let me put it in there again. I have it. There we go. Thank you, Larissa. You're quick. Larissa popped it up again. You might not have seen the chat if you came on after we popped that in. I was too early for once in my life. So that should work there. See if that does. That's really just open. So as we tick down through these topics and we hear from people who have been focusing on them, then there is the opportunity to toss questions in there. We may not answer them on the spot, to make other suggestions, anything that you might want to put in there, thought provokers, that is all fair game. So with that, I'm not really calling on people by name, but by topic. So in multimodal revenue sources, I know we have a few people who have probably given a lot of thought and long before T-Rock to this. So may I invite either of you, as it stands right now, I guess I'll call you out, Shauna or Bob, to chat with us by unmuting.
So Paul, this is Bob. I saw an email earlier that Shauna wanted a little bit extra time, so we'll try to accommodate her here. I first would like to acknowledge you and Keith and your fine leadership and keeping us all in line here as we go. It's certainly been an enjoyable process thus far, sir. But as you indicated, I do represent aviation, and I bring you greetings from aviation. I will say that during your introduction, you said there was a tight time frame here. My comments were not done in a vacuum. We did reach out to a variety of folks from the Aviation Council, the Advisory Committee, individuals in aviation across the Commonwealth. And so, some of my thoughts are, again, not done in a vacuum. But of course, I'm partial to aviation. I think it's an exciting multimodal form of transportation. And even though our footprint is small, our impact is ginormous, in my opinion. There are miles of roads and bridges around the Commonwealth, and positioned amongst them are a network of airports. And from the smallest airport at Palmyra, Pennsylvania at 1,945 feet to the longest at Philadelphia at 12,000 feet, these essential multimodal transportation centers provide access for the Commonwealth citizens for leisure, business, and freight travel throughout the world. And from right here in our own backyard in the Keystone State. And the funding for those airports is derived from an aviation fuel tax with its own legislative authorization. And so with that very brief introduction, some of our thoughts on where would we go. In the T-Rock, it was identified that there's a $10 million shortfall. And so how do we help make up that shortfall? Well, under that jet fuel tax that I just mentioned, which is at 2 cents and has not been changed in decades, we're generating about $8 to $10 million today. If you were to double that to just 4 cents, we would still be significantly under others across the Commonwealth and would generate almost the dollars we were looking for the shortfall in T-Rock. So that 10 million really with one item could be corrected. And in addition to that, we have a thought that there could be a recovery of the aviation sales tax that goes into the general fund on aviation items. If we were to recover that back to aviation, that would help recover those dollars as well. And if all those weren't quite what we had in the thought process, we considered an aircraft registration fee, and whether that registration fee be based on weight, whether it be based on value. There's a lot of schools of thought there and how that could be done. It's already done in a majority of states. It's already in practice. And it would not be unlike what happens here in the Commonwealth when you have to register your car, register your boat and your campers. And so that would give it an avenue to collect it. You wouldn't have to invent something new. And so there would be some alignment that would be necessary there, but there's an alternative. And then the last thing I have to suggest is a potential user fee. And this is kind of a broad brush that we could look at, whether we could look at it for collecting just out-of-state aircraft visiting in the Commonwealth, whether it be on future types of aviation, whatever those might be. You know, we talked about electric cars in some of your earlier programs. Who knows what aviation holds and what could be there, but some type of just general based user fee that could be open for future consideration. And so in trying to stay, I had a little discussion with Keith and to keep it in 3 to 5 minutes. I think I'm a little under that. Maybe a question or answer, I'd be happy to if I could. If not, those are our suggestions and hope they're worthy of the committee's consideration.
Fantastic. Bob Schaefer, Aviation Advisory Committee, and you're setting a good standard for us with your being so concise and so clear. I did want to pop up here for your view what has come in through the Mentimeter. So again, a number of these things we might be looking at, we will certainly be looking at after the session, but in case anything catches your attention, Bob or Shauna. And we probably won't have a lot of time today for too much back and forth on the Q&A, just with 7 presentations or more with multiple people per category. But Bob, well done. I appreciate it. How about if we come over to Shauna? I know she had some technical issues there. Are you resolved, Shauna? Are you with us? And we can certainly swing back later.
Good afternoon. I'm gonna, if you can hear me, go with the fact that I am partially resolved. Apparently,
Okay.
As long as I turn my camera on, I have sustained strength of the signal. And so I'll look forward to continuing to try to remedy that as we move throughout the agenda. Thank you, Bob, for going first. Thank you for setting such a high standard. I digress. And thank you for your brevity, which I've been told is next to godliness. I will attempt to do the same. After a conversation with Keith yesterday afternoon, I've taken a slightly different approach. During our conversation, we really talked about the importance of transit as a member of this working group, being able to provide a bit of a perspective about what other factors T-Rock should know about or be thinking about as we together move through this conversation. along those lines, I'd like to spend just a few minutes this afternoon addressing with you all some baseline information, quantifying the needs, a little bit about COVID-19 funding, if we could, at a very high level, and then really maybe just wrapping up with some concerns and how we ensure that transit is addressed moving forward as part of the larger transportation network of our state. So if we will turn maybe to a bit of background, I can tell you as a matter of information that more than 430 million passenger trips are provided through transit service across the Commonwealth annually. When we look at that, a unique and gracious and long-term thing about transit in Pennsylvania is that there is the provision of transit services in every county across the Commonwealth. When we look at the economic impact of transit, if you will, directly, transit provides 16,800 jobs across the Commonwealth. And again, that's not taking into account many indirect jobs provided through consultants, contractors. Also, certainly the access to the jobs is the larger economic piece of transit, plays an important role in the backbone of the Commonwealth's economy. Interesting things to note about the trips that we provide: 50 to 60% of these trips are work trips, and about 37% are shopping trips. From an economic point of view, I say you're either going to make money or spend money, and that is certainly good for the continued economic prosperity of Pennsylvania. Looking briefly at a profile, if you will, of who rides transit, we estimate that about 60% of our riders do not own a car. That is important as we continue to have conversations in this group that are vehicle-centric and not vehicle-centric. Again, sticking with the economic theme, as I referenced, if you look at the additional impact that transit has across the Commonwealth, there is about $434 million a year of an average annual value of the benefit of transit procurement goods and services in terms of supporting jobs and economies across the Commonwealth. That said, I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about COVID, but I think one of the central themes for this group is certainly that transit is an essential component of the economy and also the Commonwealth's economic recovery. Whether it's work, school, health, play, post-high school educational opportunities, transit takes you there.
And Sean, I don't want to get you off track. Just to note, we afforded just about or accommodated just about 5 minutes or so per topic. So
okay.
If the revenues is in the picture as well, that'd be very helpful. Thank you.
Okay, certainly. So if we could talk briefly about COVID-19, and I know there has been much emphasis and focus on the short-term emergency funding that was provided by the federal government. It's absolutely was had the opportunity for transit to have a very important and timely short-term stopgap funding to be able to provide continued vital services for frontline workers, essential employees, and of course, the uninterrupted access to crucial healthcare across the Commonwealth. But let's talk maybe briefly as we look forward into this larger funding conversation about what the federal funding did not do. It did not address the ongoing challenges and mounting expenses associated with the continuation of the pandemic. It certainly doesn't, for the purposes of this group, provide long-term, sustainable, growing, or predictable funding for transit. We certainly think as we move forward in this conversation, it's important to know that this has not been a miracle fix and transit is not, quote, taken care of for any number of years moving forward. This was absolutely stopgap funding to do some things that were vitally important in the short term. So I guess I would say it didn't solve many important funding considerations for multimodal transit in front of us. Along those lines, how am I doing on time?
Oh, you're okay. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Okay,
You're good,
now
Sean.
you got me rushing. So,
No, that's
okay,
okay.
certainly. So I may try to talk faster than Bob now. So let's see. I think just maybe in closing, if we look at the importance of robust state investment continuing in public transportation, as we talk about these funding challenges and sustainable mobility options, is going to be crucial. Transit trips across the Commonwealth look different. communities are different, but they are all important in their own ways. And so I think that's certainly something that we as a multimodal provider would want this group to remain cognizant of. There are certainly other factors in play. I'm very mindful of the priorities going on in Washington, the change in the administration, the potential carry forward to philosophies and how that folds out into policy considerations moving forward. Certainly we've seen, I know there's conversation about transit assets and this mode gets this rate of return or pays for itself. Over a career of a number of years in transportation, I'm working within a variety of modes. With no disrespect intended, I can honestly say that no transportation asset truly pays for itself. And I think that is a central and an important consideration as we work and moving forward and tackling many of these hard questions, frankly, and policy considerations. Something that I would note about transit moving forward is that we have different demographics and drivers, no pun intended. Certainly the population of the Commonwealth is aging. And also we are finding that younger drivers are delaying the decision to drive. As people return to work, that will also, we've seen trends in our commuter markets beginning to uptick. That's also driven by the change in the weather in the spring. So we believe that there will be sustained ridership returning. And while we say reopening the economy, I think it's very important to note that transit never closed. Certainly the delivery of transportation programs that were provided within Act 89 and in other important programs like the lottery were very vital for continued investment in transit. And our ability also, I think something very important to note for this group is those state funds allow us to continue leveraging federal funds. Certainly, I have a feeling I'm joined by many transit providers and PPTA board members on this call today. I know that they will be a vital part of this movement moving forward, and also the extension of the larger conversations that this body has. But certainly, I would just say in closing, I think some of the things that are most important is that we recognize the importance of certainly there are challenges at hand, but the importance of identifying a dedicated, long-term and sustainable source of funding will be one of the most important multimodal issues in terms of moving forward in the work of this group.
Thank you,
How does that
Shauna.
sound?
Oh, terrific, Shauna. Thank you. You came across well for your technical difficulties. So Shauna Russell from PPTA, so the Public Transportation Association. Really appreciate your depth of experience and expertise. And Shauna and Bob Schaefer, you will have lots to sort of mill through because a lot of people are thinking and actually putting in pretty big boxes over here on Mentimeter. So we'll have all of that for you really right at the end of the session. But of course, we'll compile that and really start to work with you and others as we move forward. So well done on the public transportation side, the whole multimodal view that we just had. We turn our attention now to mileage-based user fees, MBUF. And in this case, I believe our presenter will be Ron Drenovich. And Ron, I don't know if you've connected with any others, but Ron, former chair of Gannett Fleming and member of the Transportation Commission, so State Transportation Commission. Drenny.
Okay, well, thank you, Paul. Interesting subject and challenges ahead here. Just a little bit on the Mentimeter. The comments that came initially through on the Mentimeter from the last meeting were just outstanding, and I'll talk about them in a minute. But I did want to give a little bit of perspective here. You already discussed that we're using about $6 billion a year in fuel-related taxes in our current budget. That includes the Fed's contribution of about $2 billion, and we got another $2 billion in other funds that come in. So that gets us up around our 8.6 that we're living with right now. Although the gas tax part of it is eroding, I understand we're down some 800 million just in this last year, probably mostly due to COVID and the restrictions that we've had. Anyhow, our first goal is somehow to gain traction and on what we've been losing, just to stay even, let alone getting into the $9.3 billion that's identified as a future need. So if that all were to come from a user fee or gas tax of some sort, we're talking about between the feds and us, outstandingly big number, 6 billion that we're getting now and another 9. And I looked at the alternative sources that we have coming at us, and there were 4 broad categories, and the one involved the user fees, and the other 3 involved general transportation funds and traditional funding, which is general fund activity, and some others. Those other 3 all combined only come up to about 4.5 billion and 4.8, I guess. And whereas the user-based fees approach depending how you put them together, over $11 billion. It suggests really that the user base needs to be in the mix of resolving the issues that we're trying to address in our efforts here on the committee. The other areas are certainly necessary for filling in around the edges and doing a lot of things that all can't be picked up in the user fee. I wanted to give just a little perspective on one of those areas. This is electric vehicles. They're only about 2% of our vehicles now, but they should be projecting to be 16% or more in the next 15 years. Doesn't suggest that they're a killer at this time, but it gives us some time to address the effects of those vehicles. I see that a Tesla charges fully for a 300-mile trip on 50 kilowatt hours of power, and which they pay about 17 cents, like you and I do, a kilowatt hour. So they can fully charge their car to go 300 miles for $8.50. Pretty amazing. If we have a 20 mile per gallon vehicle that we're using now for fuel, that's 15 gallons at $3. That's $45, and that $45 includes $8.70 in tax. So you can actually charge it fully charged 300-mile electric vehicle on less than we pay on tax on a full load. It really suggests that it's not going away. I mean, there are cars and truck manufacturers now that are committing to electronic vehicles in a big term. So it's the need is there. On the other side of this, the gas tax isn't going to go away, although it's in decay, and I don't think that's going to change. Now, I looked at a number of the issues related to the Mentimeter comments and what the user fees, what the challenges are in putting in a multi-mileage-based user fee or vehicle mileage tax. First off, there are some states that are trying it, and I think there's a dozen more that have now put in some legislation to at least allow pilot programs to develop. One of the biggest comments, and it's the most valid of all of them, we can't do this alone. There's too much through state and transportation through the state not to affect everybody around us. So even though we are very heavily dependent on the gas tax, and some of our other states around us are not, they need to be in the program. And perhaps the biggest one that needs to be in the program is the federal government, for the Federal Highway Administration. They're in the same bind that we are. I mean, they haven't changed anything since 1993, and that 18 cents is probably worth about a dime now compared to what it was then. And they've got to be looking at the same user-based fee. And I think it makes sense that we look really hard at moving into that area. I do know that Oregon, since 2015, has had trials going on. It hasn't been widely accepted, although they gave opportunities for people to participate in it. It's got to work somehow. You can certainly do it with polling, so it just invades privacy. Cost of collection was an issue raised in it, and that's real. But technology, as it is now and as it is developing, is immense. Actually, 20 years ago, I had a son still in Texas that had a Corvette, and he paid $90 a year for insurance on that car. But if he drove it, he paid more. So Progressive actually had a device in his car that knew where his car was all the time, whether it was moving or not. So if he drove it, he may pay another $100 in 1 month because he drove it, and it depended on where he drove it, if it was in a difficult area or if it was in rush hours and that sort of thing. That's 20 years ago, and that technology is just immense now and what can be done. We do need, more than anything else, maybe a public communication strategy. People do not understand and probably fear the privacy issues. We face it with what we're doing on the turnpike with Easy Pass. A lot of people will still pay twice as much in cash to avoid being identified or going down an Easy Pass road. So a big education, and then a open dialogue and open awareness for putting together a secure system to do so. We have some time. I don't think there's any question about that. But we need time. This is probably the most difficult area to actually implement. But the potential is so significant relative to the issues that we're facing here in Pennsylvania that it needs to start now, even if it's on a pilot basis or in a small way, even if it's locally in some areas, a whole plan needs to be developed and put together. I don't think we can solve the problem without a mileage-based user fee of some sort as we go ahead. And to see that in place in 15 years or so, operating smoothly, might be a very good goal, but it needs to start now. Other than that, I think it's interesting to see the broad perspective that so many people on this group have that came through Mentimeter, and I think it's everything that's been brought up in those comments is valid and needs to be addressed. Some are very serious, and some are considerations that we wouldn't have thought of even in a smaller group at all. But that's what I have.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ron. And added to that rich trove of information from Mentimeter is more from the same source, which is really the commission. And I think some people are pointing out the technical challenges. Ron points out we have time, the need for federal component being a real leadership position. But I think there are also some really nuanced considerations in here, even citing the efficiency currently of the administration of the fuel tax. And we're certainly not hearing it's an immediate abandonment of that. So superb. So we'll feed this back to that group. And thank you for keeping the ideas flowing on that. Thanks for helping to frame that for us indeed. As we turn our attention to vehicle registration fees, I believe we have Rebecca Euler queued up. I think Ted Leonard might have teamed up with you, but he had another granddaughter born, if I understand it. So from the Pennsylvania Motor Truck Association, Rebecca, nice to and now see you again and hear you.
Yes. Hello, Paul. Thank you. Yes, I have some comments that Ted sent along to me to pass on. So we wish him all the best with his new grandchild. And I'm happy to sort of pass on his comments too. So anyway, thank you. And I want to recognize and thank Secretary Gramian for really recognizing the need to sort of be on equal footing with regard to our base understanding of some of these issues. And I'm going to kind of take that as an excuse to step back for a minute and talk about registration fees with regard to trucks, because it's not a simple matter. And I know, being relatively new here, it took me a while to understand it. So I thought I would just take a few minutes and to describe how registration fees work with trucks in particular, to sort of level set everybody's understanding. It's not really a simple matter, like I said, with regard to trucks. Well, let me back up for a second. I did want to touch on, a little more from the industry's perspective. There are about 37,440 trucking companies in Pennsylvania, just to sort of give everybody an idea of how big the industry is here. There are about 321,000 trucking jobs. And we know that over 96% of manufactured tonnage transported in Pennsylvania is transported on trucks. And that said, too, we know that 88% of Pennsylvania's communities just depend exclusively on trucks to get their goods. So trucking really is an integral part of the economy. So something we really need to think about as we're setting the agenda here. But with regard to registration and trucks, there are really three separate broad categories of truck registrations that we need to talk about. The first is trucks under 26,000 pounds. Those are your small sort of delivery trucks that we see on the roads every day. Those are not required to be apportioned. And I'll get to explain what apportioned registration is here in a minute. But those trucks can drive in every state and they can register anywhere. So they are not required to be registered in Pennsylvania. They can register anywhere and they can drive amongst all the states. So that's sort of one category of truck. And then we have to get to the heavier trucks, which are those over 26,000 pounds. So two categories of those. There are the ones that don't travel outside the state. They do deliveries, pickup and deliveries in the state. They only pay Pennsylvania registration fees. So whatever the registration fee is in Pennsylvania for those heavier trucks, that is exactly what they pay. For trucks that are over 26,000 pounds and actually travel between states, they must have apportioned registration. And this is where it gets a little tricky. The way apportioned registration works is through the International Registration Plan, or the IRP. And it's basically designed to avoid the need for truckers to register in every state. Each state has a different apportioned registration fee, as we know. So the state where the truck is registered is responsible for collecting that fee, and a percentage of the fee is sent to other states based on the number of miles that the truck operated in that state in the previous year. For example, if 90% of a truck's travel is in Pennsylvania, even if, for example, the truck is registered in Maryland, the registration for the truck would be 90% of Pennsylvania's fee, even if the truck is registered elsewhere. So out-of-state trucks in that apportioned category are paying Pennsylvania registration. So I wanted to make sure that was clear, because it is sort of complicated to understand, but it does play into the issue here, because there are a lot of unintended consequences with, raising the fees of those different categories of trucks. So for apportioned trucks, generally, the higher the truck registration fee, the less incentive the trucking companies will want to drive in Pennsylvania. So that makes us less competitive for attracting trucking companies to base their operations here, and also to serve customers in Pennsylvania. So even though all apportioned trucks driving through Pennsylvania pay Pennsylvania's registration fees proportionate to how much they drive here, basing themselves in Pennsylvania means that if the fee is high here, they're going to pay a higher fee to travel in and out of their home state. They're going to be disproportionately impacted if they're Pennsylvania trucking companies. And just here, backing up to a little bit about amount of the fees, Act 89 raised class 25 truck fees, which is the heaviest class, from $1,687 to this year, they'll be going up to $2,417. And inflationary increases, just like car registration fees after that. So that is a 43% increase in truck registration fees since Act 89 passed. And just for comparison purposes, car registration fees have increased only 8%. So trucks really are paying, a lot in registration fees here. They have disproportionately been impacted by the fee increases. And Pennsylvania is number 17 in registration fees for trucks in the country. We are above average. And when in 2021, when the new fees go into effect, we'll be number 15. In combination with our fuel taxes here in Pennsylvania, this makes us the third highest the third highest state in the nation for cost to operate a truck. So this really does disincentivize trucking operations in Pennsylvania. So that is an unintended consequence we need to talk about. Our registration fees for trucks here are higher than almost all of our surrounding states, except for West Virginia. They're a little bit higher than us, but otherwise, all our surrounding states are lower, and the average is about $2,006 compared to the $2,417 will be this year for our biggest trucks. Let's see. I wanted to hit on, and although we agree that raising registration fees is absolutely a viable way to raise funding for roads and bridges, because there are so many unintended consequences. I think we really need to back up and talk about considering different categories of registrations separately. not just as was proposed, just increasing all registration fees across the board by 100 or 200%. It really does depend on different types of vehicles, and for trucks, whether or not they're apportioned, non-apportioned. So like I said, Pennsylvania is already third in the nation for cost to run a truck, and increasing registration fees by even 100% would make us first in the nation. And that's not somewhere where I think we want to be. Raising registration fees on apportioned trucks does cause out-of-state trucking companies to pay more, but it also, like I said, hurts PA trucking companies disproportionately because they have to travel more in-state to get to and from their home base. And raising back to the less than 26,000 pound trucks, raising those fees and fees on non-apportioned trucks only hurts Pennsylvania trucking companies because they're only paying Pennsylvania registration fees. So the more expensive we make those smaller trucks, less than 26,000 pounds to register, the more of them will register out of state because it will be too expensive here and we'll get nothing from them, including fuel tax or registration fees. So I just wanted to sort of wrap up here by saying that Pennsylvania is already not a good place to do business for trucking companies. Raising costs will make it even worse. And because margins are so low, out-of-state companies may choose not to take loads in and out of Pennsylvania. And this has dire consequences for our economy. In-state companies will find it harder to sustain their business and to support businesses and communities around the state. And ultimately that will mean less trucks in Pennsylvania to pick up raw materials, manufacturing components, and take them elsewhere. Farmers may not be able to get goods to market. Companies may choose not to invest here because transportation is too expensive. So these are some of the unintended consequences that we need to think about when we think about registration fees. Now, I just wanted to bring up Ted's, facts here that he had sent, some of the contributions that he had from AAA's perspective. Most of all, I think he was recommending incremental increases rather than sudden leaps. And part of this, I think, is because of fuel cost increases that we're seeing right now. The national average for 87 regular gas is $2.89. Pennsylvania's 301, which higher summer fuel costs we'll see via at the pump, he says, and oil prices are up significantly from last year. So that has a short and long-term impact for revenue when the 2021 gas taxes are factored in next year. So some concern about him, some concern from him about being able to absorb those increases if not made incrementally. And then he said that back of the envelope, the average registration fee is about $71. At $78, if Pennsylvania increased their registration fees by 100%, that would make us the 11th highest in the country. And he also wanted to note that approximately 17 other states use variable model basing fees on things like weight, horsepower, age, or market value of the vehicle. So if that's something we wanted to talk about, I think he wanted to bring up the fact that other states are using those types of models as well. So hopefully that covers.
Very good, Rebecca. Yeah, and thank you for covering for Ted. And to a point you made in your presentation, you're really advising that we kind of delineate and talk about the different categories of registration fees. We have been doing that with just a broad brush thus far, and we have to really dig into that and understand it. Thank you for your very straightforward presentation. We appreciate that a lot.
Thank you.
Got a couple of ideas into the Menti, and I'm going to advance the Menti, which is just going to cue us up for the broad topic of tolling scenarios. So that's actually how we termed it when we went with this, tolling scenarios. And I have information that Mark Compton will lead the way for us here. And then we have more. Mark.
Great, Paul. Thank you very much. And also thanks to who I call our chair, and who there's also the Secretary of Transportation and the administration for including us into this program and on this task force. And it's timely, as today we at the Turnpike make our last quarterly payment to PennDOT for this year. $112.5 million is in the mail today, as they say. So one more year to go into the program, so this is obviously timely. For those of you that don't know, tolling has been around in the Commonwealth for a very long time. Here at the Turnpike, it's been around since 1940. And even prior to that, the Camelback Bridge, which connected the East Shore and the West Shore, opened in 1816. And at that time, there was 6 cents per pedestrian and 32 cents per two-wheeled wagon. So we were even axle and profile before it was cool, all the way back in 1816. Tolling has been endorsed by both of the mobility partnerships as well. So the mobility partnerships, if you don't know, were two efforts that went on both in the East and the West. Partnered with Catherine Kellerman in the West out at her organization, and with Leslie Richards in the East with hers. And in that came a myriad of scenarios that were to be looked at, sort of what we're doing here. And I must tell you that tolling did rise to the top in both of those reports as well. Now, as we sit here today, and I say that because we do know that there's some movement federally that can make some changes to this. But as we sit here today, there are really 4 ways in which you can toll under federal guidelines. The first 2 ways are known as sort of mainstream areas, which means as long as you follow the guidelines, you can do it without real requirement of getting into a pilot program. One is known as Section 129, which candidly is how the Pathways Major Bridge Initiatives is moving forward. But it typically falls into either that or reconstruction or of a bridge or tunnel, as well as adding new construction, which would require or new capacity in most cases. So that's one that we are getting familiar with under the Pathways Project, and one that is available to us as long as we meet the requirements. The second one under that program is known as Section 166. That has very limited applicability in PA because it typically requires you to take an existing HOV, highway occupancy lane, and take it to a hot or an express lane, which would add a toll to those. We don't have a lot of that. Those are really geared towards much more of your urban areas. The second two pilot programs that could come into play here, or one especially, is the value pricing pilot program. This one, and I do recall that PennDOT has applied for this program. I must tell you, I need to check back with my colleagues there. I'm not sure where the application stands, but this does require approval, but really gears towards congestion pricing and congestion mitigation. So this too would gear in towards high traffic areas, high volume traffic areas. So could be applicable in areas of Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, maybe Allentown, some parts of Harrisburg. So there is opportunity with that program, which is why I know the Commonwealth did apply. And the last program that's still in the books that has very, very little use and was really the program that was to be utilized had I-80 been told back so many years ago in 2007, is the Interstate System Reconstruction and Rehab Pilot Program. Really, it's been tough for anyone to meet the parameters of that program. And I know that there was a lot of states that were parked in that program, but to my knowledge, no one has yet been able to move forward on that. So I know I'm going to turn it over here to my colleague and our good Chairman Carroll, who also will speak to this. But the last point on this is with reauthorization and some moves afoot at the federal level, perhaps we can get some significant changes to the programs that aren't usable, but also look forward to working with my task force members here on the programs that are applicable here to Pennsylvania. So with that, I'll turn it over to Chairman Carroll.
Thank you, Mark, and Paul, thank you for your leadership in this effort. I'll take a minute to highlight the PennDOT Pathways Major Bridge Initiatives program that I'm certain everyone in this Zoom has heard of. And it is PennDOT's action and the P3 board's action in an effort to try and solve substantial transportation problems in our network with respect to 9 bridges on our interstate system. There's a little bit of history. Back in 2012, House Bill 3, which later became Act 88, when it was signed by the governor in July of that year, created the 3P model that exists today. And that 3P model established a board that was populated by the caucuses and by the governor's office And that board in November of last year authorized PennDOT to go down the path of identifying potential bridge candidates, which they announced subsequently in February. Fair to say, there's been plenty of conversation across the Commonwealth with respect to the need to do this tolling and whether the bridges that were identified are the right ones. And that conversation is ongoing. I will simply say, as somebody who, oddly enough, I voted against the bill back in 2012, but then voted for the 3P proposal as a board member in November. In my view, because of an inaction both in Washington and in Harrisburg to solve a series of problems related to the motor license fund that all of us are familiar with, this solution set generated substantial amounts of money in the hundreds of millions or billions of dollars that are desperately needed to maintain the highway and bridge network that we have. And there really is no easy way to raise hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars for a transportation network. Considering the other options that are on the table, we talked about registration fees or electric vehicle fees and such. The likelihood is that none of those will generate the kinds of dollars that are necessary to solve this problem. And so you have to really look at the big pieces on the chessboard with respect to transportation funding. The state police allocation from the motor license fund is clearly one, but tolling is another option. And it was an option that was envisioned by the General Assembly in 2012 with the creation of the 3P model. And so I'll end by simply saying that there's an ongoing conversation in the General Assembly on what to do about the decision to move forward with the bridge tolling. But my suspicion is that there will be more tolling in the future than there is today, because of an unwillingness in Washington especially, but even in the states, to do the liquid fuel tax increases, and especially here in Pennsylvania with the rate that we have now. So whether or not these 9 bridges end up getting tolled at the end of the day remains a little bit of an open question. But for those that say no, my question is then tell me what instead. And so I'll end there, Paul, and let others speak if they have comments about tolling generally.
Yes, and thank you, Representative Carroll from the House Transportation Committee. And we have others who did participate. Jeff Isman from the SILC, from the State Independent Living Council, was also giving some thought to this. So this one obviously touches us all in many, many ways. Jeff, if you have a minute or two and care to speak, we'll certainly afford you that opportunity. And I see you over there. Do you want to be unmuted? There you go.
Okay, great.
Hey, Jeff, we hear you.
Hey. Yeah, I think whatever we do has to be a measured approach in terms of tolling. So we need to consider, I think, some of the different populations that are impacted. I'm thinking in rural areas where sometimes people have to drive pretty far for not necessarily the highest paying jobs. What's going to be the impact? And we want people to work. I know it's a big issue for people with disabilities in terms of even just getting transportation with the shared ride programs and other things or accessible vehicles. But if the tolling costs are too high along with fuel, then it's going to discourage work, or we'll say behaviors in a lot of people. And it's going to discourage community, in my opinion. So I think that's something that has to be considered. Maybe some idea of like tolling passes for locals, even for just local traffic. When people would register for a pass, they just basically, if you live within certain areas that are being tolled, maybe you get a certain price for that pass, which would be different than maybe companies from out of state or in other parts of Pennsylvania that may be using those roads. So I guess one of the questions I would have too is on a tolling scenario, what's different with what PennDOT's proposing today as compared to what was proposed during the Rendell administration, which had gotten rejected for tolling I-80 by both the Bush and the Obama administration. So what are we doing differently in terms of the tolling package that's going to be presented? So I think there are some things to consider there. So those would be my thoughts initially. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you, Jeff.
Paul,
And yep.
This is Howard Cohen. I was on the
Great.
P3 board that voted in favor of this tolling proposal. And I want to commend Representative Mike Carroll for his presentation. And Ron Drenovich knows a lot more about this than I do. But the point that Jeff just made is one that Secretary Gramian has certainly considered and has a team working on, as well as consideration for the economic impact that might occur to communities around a bridge that might be tolled for diversion of trucks and other transit. And I just think that the Senate of Pennsylvania has just voted on and had a hearing on the tolling issue. It's unfortunate that many of the senators continue to consider taxation or a user tax as a user fee as a tax, which it isn't. And that's been decided in courts and by economists for years. And the work that's the secretary and her team are doing on the P3 tolling of bridges that are in desperate need of repair should be considered by this organization, this group, because as Ron and others have pointed out, there is no other way that we considered or can think of that gives you the revenue you need to do the job that must be done. And with that, I'll shut up.
We are glad to hear from you with your perspective as well, Howard. Any others on this who might have been participating on that thought process, in that thought process? Obviously, a lot to consider there. And we're going to move it on. Thank you. So from tolling scenarios, we go to a different look entirely, taxing scenarios. And I believe that Secretary Hassel of Revenue is going to speak with us today. Do I have that right, Secretary?
Yes, thanks, Paul. Sorry, I had to find my mute button.
Yes. And I do have your visual aid if you want me to bring that up as well, Secretary Hassel.
I think that would be great. So I have not had a chance to connect with others on this issue. So really, I'm really speaking as the state's tax administrator at this point, speaking for myself and the Revenue Department as the people who collect most of the Commonwealth's revenue. And there are some high-level issues that I would recommend that the commissioners keep in mind as we move forward in this process. And we've touched on some of them already. And of course, there are legal constraints in what the Commonwealth can do in terms of imposing taxes. Obviously, first and foremost in the Pennsylvania Constitution, there's a uniformity clause. So all taxes shall be uniform upon the same class of subjects within the territorial limits of the authority levying the tax. So, for example, if the General Assembly imposes a sales tax, it has to apply in all counties. Very basic. The General Assembly could not carve out, Dauphin County from the tax. It has to apply statewide. However, they can delegate taxing authority to the county level or school district, as they have on some occasions. And then you have a lower level of government that is authorized to impose a tax, and then it has to be uniform within their jurisdiction. So that's generally the way that we would look at that. The other important constitutional provision on taxation we've also talked about concerning gasoline tax and motor registration fees and those kind of things. The clear language here is that that those revenues have to be used solely for construction, reconstruction, maintenance, and repair of and safety on public highways and bridges, and can't be diverted by transfer or otherwise to any other purpose. So it creates a sort of legal wall around those types of revenues that have to be used for transportation. And it's kind of a unique restriction. There's a similar provision regarding aviation fuel revenue in the same way restricted to support aviation. And I just want to note that the way that that language is written, it's not just the gas tax, it includes any other excise tax imposed on products used in motor transportation. So if we were to be looking at other types of taxation on motor fuels, then the same rules would apply. There's also federal constitutional considerations to keep in mind here. One of the important ones is the Interstate Commerce Clause. And it basically, to make a complicated provision simple, it basically prohibits a state from imposing a tax that places a heavier burden on out-of-state businesses than it imposes on its own residents in similar circumstances. This was the issue that led to the case that went to the US Supreme Court, ATA v. Shiner. In 1987, the US Supreme Court struck down Pennsylvania's axle tax for exactly this reason. The court found that the axle tax imposed a heavier burden on out-of-state trucking companies than it did on in-state trucking companies. And it's also something we have to keep in mind here. For instance, there's been some discussion on this panel about the possibility of a tax on goods delivered into Pennsylvania. And my recommendation is we think carefully about how that is structured, for the simple reason that you could run afoul of the Interstate Commerce Clause easily. And I'm not here to give a legal opinion on it, but I'm saying that it raises that issue potentially. Just to take a simple example, if I'm in the market to buy a television, I could go online and buy that television from Amazon, and they would deliver it to my house and potentially be subject to that tax. But on the other hand, if I went to a local store, to Best Buy, Walmart, whatever, and purchased the same good, then that tax would presumably not apply. And that kind of disparity can raise a constitutional issue. You could easily have Walmart, in my example, bringing a challenge to say that that's a violation of the Interstate Commerce Clause. I also wanted to put in front of you just some high-level considerations for things that we pay attention to in our business. And again, just kind of based on my decades of experience rather than anything formal. But we need to keep in mind that the tax administration needs to be efficient. And that means there needs to be clear and simple calculation of the tax, a simple process to report and pay, and collection at source. And let me explain a little bit about that. What we have found is that the most efficient way to collect a tax is at the point where a payment is being made from one party to another. So, for example, my employer, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, is required to withhold income tax from my wages before I get a paycheck. And my employer is a third party who has no incentive, no interest in helping me to avoid federal income tax. And so they have an incentive to get it right, to make sure that they're not subject to penalties. But it's a process that has really helped to make sure that the collection is efficient, because it doesn't leave it in my hands to write a check and to send it into the IRS or the State Department of Revenue. Under enforcement, again, some obvious points. We need to make sure that we're looking at taxes that are not easily avoided. Tax reporting that can be verified from third-party sources. Again, in my example, my employer sends me a W-2 and a copy to the IRS at the end of the year. They are a third party in my tax obligations, and the IRS then can easily verify that I've paid the correct amount of tax on my wages. And then thirdly, the legal processes to enforce a tax if necessary. If I don't do what I'm supposed to do, the IRS has the ability to garnish my wages, seize my bank account or whatever. Hopefully those steps aren't necessary, but knowing that they are available to the IRS, I'm much more likely to try to do the right thing. The third major category here is that we respect people's due process rights. Under the Constitution, we all have the right to due process of law. And in the tax world, that means I have a right to appeal an assessment or to file a petition for refund if I think I've paid too much. So we have to make sure that we are respecting those rights. The final point I wanted to make here is that, as I mentioned, currently the gas tax revenue has this sort of legal wall around it because of constitutional provisions in the Pennsylvania Constitution. But there are many things that have permanent funding streams attached to them in Pennsylvania law that don't have that constitutional protection, but still there's a guaranteed funding source that's provided in a statute. There are quite a number of provisions in the state tax code that direct my department, the State Department of Revenue, to transfer a certain amount of money out of the general fund to a special fund for a particular purpose. And for example, the law says that roughly 5.3% of the sales tax is dedicated to mass transit funding. Currently, that's around $900 million a year, scheduled to increase to almost $1.4 billion in 22-23. And it's not a constitutional guarantee, but because it's automatic, it's directive to my agency, and it's something that we do as a routine basis, then it is a permanent funding stream for a particular program. And it's a way that you could consider setting up a funding stream that isn't dependent on the constitutional guarantee that's attached to the gas tax currently. So let me stop there and turn it back over to you, Paul.
I do appreciate that, Secretary. We will certainly make that document available to everyone as well. Thanks for getting that out to us. I'm going to pause for a moment before we go on to local solutions. So we'll queue up Dave and Amy, but you get a breathing moment there. In my zeal to move us forward, I might have neglected to give Leanne a moment to chat with you. She represents ACEC, so the Council of Engineering Companies for Pennsylvania.
Paul, this is Howard Cohen. I want to just
Yes.
commend Dan Hassel for his presentation. I'm a former revenue secretary and sat at that desk for Dick Thornburg. And the points he makes are very important. And he's made them with great clarity. And we must consider them as we go forward. I personally, although I haven't looked at the law on this, would have thought that a non-appropriated piece of the gasoline tax to the state police budget that was not related directly to transportation, such as on the turnpike, might have violated this provision of the law. There's a difficulty as to who might have standing to bring that case, but that's another matter. And the legislature has done what it's done, and we have followed that law, even though we have diverted money from transit for police activities, primarily in rural areas. But the Hassel presentation is one that deserves careful attention, and I'm delighted that he has participated in this program.
Thank you very much, Howard. I just want to point out that in the constitutional language that I had on the screen dedicating the gasoline tax. One of the purposes that are allowed there is safety on public highways. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, that is the basis on which motor license fund money flows to the state police.
No, that is quite correct, and that's the basis. But to the best of my knowledge, and I sort of track your department as a hobby, I don't think that's ever been audited or allocated in a precise way. So the gross numbers that have been used have not been followed up with any kind of audit for their allocation outside of the turnpike.
Thank you. Indeed, we might even, if we had more time, we could all share our hobbies. Howard, you might have set off a theme for us to go for right there, but can't beat that one. Thank you both, Secretary and former Secretary. And then I'm going to bounce back over to Leanne and a little step back just on tolling from an engineering perspective on the consulting community.
Thank you, Paul. That's Leanne from ACCPA. And I do want to echo what Representative Carroll and of course Mark Compton said regarding tolling and all of their knowledge and information that they supplied. One thing just for all of those people out there listening, I know it's come up. There have been, a lot of questions about tolling, whether it's fair, unfair. I do see some things in the chat now talking about how tolling can be flexible. So I think if we have to take a step back and really think about tolling as that user fee, as opposed to a tax, I think that's going to be a priority. The other thing I think in the tolling scenarios that a lot of people are concerned about, which tends to make people shy away from it, is what happens to the communities surrounding those areas of tolling with congestion or people trying to get around the tolls, maybe going into communities. I will at this point give kudos to PennDOT. They are looking at those types of situations and where that could happen. And I just, for those who are not familiar with really how construction projects work, whenever there is a project, there's always community engagement. There's always discussing things with the community, looking at the impacts in a community, whatever type of project it is, and that would be no different with any type of tolling scenario. But it is under consideration. So for those who are unfamiliar at what could be the benefits versus the risks or the issues, especially with our communities, those are at the highest priority to always be looked at and to be addressed. I don't think anyone makes the decision to say we're going to toll something without looking at all of those items. So I just want to make sure that that's out there so people can hear that and know that no one would say, let's just toll this or have a user fee or congestion pricing without really looking at all of those items and the impacts in the community. So from that perspective, wanted to kind of make sure we set that straight and thank Mark and Representative Carroll for some great comments as well. But that's it. Thank you, Paul.
Excellent. Yeah, and thank you, Leanne. I should also recognize that helping out with the taxing scenarios is Jerry Sweeney. And Jerry, I don't know if we were able to connect in our compressed timetable or whether you wanted to speak. Jerry represents the Southeast Partnership for Mobility. No need to, but I just don't want to step right over you if you're with us.
I am here and appreciate all the great commentary and look forward to further discussions, but nothing to add at this point.
We'll take it, Jerry. We thank you. And that takes us on to local solutions. And in the case of local solutions, we invited Dave Senko, Executive Director of the State Association of Township Supervisors, to think about it. And we also invited Amy Kessler. Now, I'm in the habit of just saying from North Central, but I should, in a more formal environment, say the North Central Pennsylvania Regional Planning and Development Commission. And Amy, Dave will happily defer to you if you want to get the ball rolling, and he'll pick it up as appropriate.
Bless your heart, Dave. Again, thanks, Paul, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to have a brief discussion on local solutions. I think when Dave and I were talking, I think one of the things that neither of us were completely positive about is, or one thing we were certain about, is that our local governments can't be forgotten in the discussion of the ability to maintain their assets and having local resources to maintain them. When we're talking about a lot of these shortfalls in revenue, is it really clear that municipal assets are included in whatever that top line figure is, the $9 billion, $10 billion? And that's just something to be clear, because the one thing that does trickle down is mandates to local governments to figure out how to maintain, whether it's stormwater, whether it's local dollars to support their infrastructure, the matchability, that's always been a challenge. So it's something that we discuss pretty heavily. But a few items that I'm going to bring to the table, and then Dave can add some 2 cents, is from a local source. I think that an opportunity for all of us to look at is the HOP permitting process, and looking at the impacts that come in. You know, every trip that's developed has an impact as part of the development. And what we typically see is a lot of developers, when that HOP trigger, for a lack of a better phrase, kicks in, they go to the state for multimodal funds or other resources to pay for the improvement that their development has cost. And that's on the back of the taxpayer. And I think that there's an opportunity to look at those HOP permits and require the developer or the established business that's going into an industrial park or whatever to make those infrastructure improvements versus the DOT chasing after those opportunities, or that local government making those improvements. So there was one opportunity that we talked about for local solutions. Another one that was talked about is, you know, the legislature a few years ago passed the ability for counties to generate county $5 fees on vehicle registrations. And very few counties took advantage of that. I think the challenge you have in rural areas is it would take them decades to raise enough money to maintain a bridge. So there wasn't the appetite on a $5 fee. But in some of the more populated counties, there might be a need to take a look at that legislation to allow them to increase that $5 fee periodically to keep up with inflation and to keep maintaining their assets. Another one that we talked about briefly is the funding that gets allocated to local municipalities and counties. More of a clarification point, and I think this is where, you know, Paul, you and Keith, and maybe even the folks at PennDOT can help verify this information. But the formula that's used to go from the gas tax to counties is based on information from 1931 and 32, and road mileage. Now, in rural Pennsylvania, our population was probably higher in 1931, 32, so it might hurt us making that suggestion. But understanding that population in Pennsylvania has shifted, and if we're using formulas from that far back, we need to really look at that to support our municipalities and our communities to maintain and invest in their own communities through the revenue that we're providing. Let me see what else I have. And then, you know, an opportunity also exists for consideration is looking at the vast amount of right-of-way that our DOT handles and what's allowed to be in that right-of-way. We have a lot of utility companies that utilize that. Are they charging when we widen the road into our own right-of-way to come and move those utilities? If so, should they be in those utility right-of-ways? Or is there an opportunity for us to look at transportation like a utility and start charging them for being in that right-of-way? Using that right-of-way and putting broadband into it to expand opportunities to generate additional income for communities. So those were a few things that you know have come back to me as part of our conversation with funding for local government. But it's important that money trickles down into that local government. You know, you look at the state of Georgia, they had a sales tax referendum that went to the ballots, and 1 or 2 cent sales tax, and 75% of that stayed in the region. And of that 75, 25 went right to the local municipality to maintain. So money generated through a sales tax, you know, regional taxing authorities as well provide opportunities to invest in infrastructure that's multi-municipal, multi-county, that move people and goods through the Commonwealth. So that's a high level of some of the ideas that came on from people that I talked to and from Dave and I's conversations. So then I'll defer to Dave if anything that I missed or he wanted to elaborate on.
Okay, thanks, Amy. Yeah, I think Amy sums up, I would say ditto to everything that she said, sums up well. And some of the additional commentary that we've collected and heard really surrounds just the nature of local government being a partner in this transportation network process. And everything we've talked about so far, including the funding shortfall, whether the 9 billion is the right number or the wrong number, doesn't include anything at the local level. I guess, I mean, we're kind of having a lot of these conversations, and we're in many ways we're talking about building a platform as though COVID and this pandemic didn't happen. And we're not asking, I don't think we're asking the tough questions about what are commute patterns going to look like? Is work from home going to become a reality? Is that going to put a greater burden on local networks on the first and last mile? Is a lot of the e-commerce components going to stay in place? We've heard a lot about and I appreciate Secretary Hessel's comment about the tax for deliveries, but we've heard it, discussed as a fee. And I certainly am not an attorney, nor do I even play one on TV. But there's enough lawyers in the legislature and in Pennsylvania that we can, if we want to have a fee, we can figure out how to go about doing that. I mean, one of the things that we've heard from some of our members and other local governments is, as you talk about that, and maybe this is something that consultants could help us with, what's the difference between a delivery fee for parcel versus on total value of the transaction? Is that something that comes into play? I mean, we're seeing these, Amazon delivery vans show up in a neighborhood, 13 times a day. But they're using that infrastructure. So we kind of talk about that, and then that the locals are just, at the end of the day, they maintain more roads and bridges than all of PennDOT combined, and for that, their funding comes from a portion of the gas tax, 500 million a year, and the premise of the press release of eliminating the gas tax. I mean, is that something that is that even a valid premise? And I was encouraged earlier to hear somebody say, look, the gas tax is dying and dwindling, but it's probably not something that you just wipe off the books. I mean, the amount of money that comes from the gas tax to local governments doesn't even cover the cost of local governments maintaining all the traffic lights and stormwater. That aren't even on necessarily local roads. I mean, and I don't know if everybody knows this, but in Pennsylvania, there are some 14,000 traffic lights. 9 of them are maintained by the state. All the rest are maintained by locals. And there's an incredible cost that comes with that. So as we talk about funding formulas and shifting allocations and the exclusion of local governments in that distribution of whatever a broad-based solution is, at the end of the day, local roads, the reality is local roads are getting paid for by property taxes. So, if there are going to be more mandates that are shifted from the legislature or the administration or from PennDOT down to the locals because they'll let them take care of it, that is in fact going to yield higher property taxes on residents. And I'm not sure I don't think anybody thinks that's a good idea. In terms of some of the, there are other costs that come with the unfunded mandates. And as we talk about how we go about doing this process and doing transportation moving forward, are those cost figures correct to begin with? Are they too high, or are they too low? I mean, are we going to soon run into a challenge of by virtue of all of the stimulus money that's laying out there, and if we come up with new ways of funding projects, are we going to have material and labor shortages, which are going to drive the cost of these projects even higher? And are we going to be back to where we started? In terms of funding options, I mean, we've the tolling user fees, those are I think probably natural items that are going to come into play to replace some of the other things. Vehicle miles traveled is a tough sell in Pennsylvania, in a large area where you have to drive long distances just to get to the doctor's or the grocery store or getting to work. I mean, the vehicle property tax is, some have said there's a fairness to that, because you essentially you pay what you drive. So if you want to drive around in a $75,000 car, you're gonna pay a little bit more than somebody who's driving around in a $15,000 vehicle. And again, back just restating on the delivery fees, and that some of that be probably dedicated to local, because that's where the impact is going to be on local roads. But we welcome the partnership with the department and everybody else on the committee here, but also want to make sure that there's a fair recognition that there are significant costs that locals are already bearing on the system. And I didn't even talk about the cost of sidewalks or signage or bike lanes or street lights or bridge inspections. So there's a lot on the table. Thanks.
Thank you, Dave. Indeed. So, hey, we are coming to the close of this segment with the PSP funding reduction. Bob Latham is leader of APC, the Associated Pennsylvania Constructors. And Bob, I have a late breaking graphic for you, but I have two choices: PSP funding as of 2020 or letting history.
Well, let's go with the PSP funding first, Paul, and then we'll pivot back to the other one.
Alrighty.
Thanks. Hello, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to give an introduction to this subject. Appreciate the reference to this issue by Secretary Hassel, because it certainly teed it up as well. The diversion of money from the motor license fund, I think, is the elephant in the room when we talked about transportation funding. And I think that this graph, and those of you who are associated with the General Assembly, either members or staff, I hope you're going to see this graph a lot over the next 8 weeks or so. So the bottom line is, going back to many administrations, we have slowly ratcheted up the amount of money coming from the motor license fund over to the general fund to pay for the operations of the state police. And since Act 89 was passed in 2013, as you can see on our graph there, that we have shifted some $5 billion out of the motor license fund. And again, the monies, just for clarity, this comes after the distribution to local governments and to other agencies. So this purely comes from PennDOT's program. And if you go back to the other graph quickly, Paul, I just want to show some of the impact. Now, this is what we call lettings, or value of construction contracts that have been bid and awarded in a calendar year. And you can see the net result of Act 89. There are a number of things that have impacted the downturn over the last couple of years, certainly COVID in 2020, and certainly the increase in fuel efficiency and reduction in gas tax revenue, the lack of indexing, et cetera. But if you go back to the other graph, you can kind of get a flavor that one of the big issues that has had a tremendous impact on the department's ability to deliver the promises of Act 89 has been this skyrocket of monies going from the motor license fund to the general fund from 2013 to 2018. And yes, we appreciate sort of the glide path down a little bit that was enacted in 2017, and that is helpful. But we are still at $750 million that comes right off the top that could be applied to funding for roads and bridges. Just very briefly, I think that this is something that actually could be attacked now. We've talked about the American Rescue Plan. The state of Pennsylvania stands to get $7.2 billion or 7 point whatever billion dollars over the next 2 fiscal years. Clearly, a portion of that can be used to alleviate, and I'm going to ask you to flip back to that other graph one more time, to alleviate the situation that we have and move some of those letting numbers or those construction contract numbers back up in the short term. All of the other solutions that we are talking about today, quite simply, are not going to impact this chart in the next 2 to 3 years. So if we can move on the state police now, we can have an impact on the immediate term while we discuss, debate, and come to solutions. All the stuff we've talked about today are all very important, very good things. They're going to require some conversation. None of this is going to happen next year. It's not going to happen, probably not even the year after that. Maybe the year after that, but certainly not immediately. A move in this budget session that could, draw down, accelerate some of that money back to the motor license. And the one other point I would like to make on that is that although the state police is the lion's share of diversion from the motor license fund, there are other agencies that have their hand in the till as well. So I guess as we move forward in this, I'd like to expand this conversation to weights and measures for agriculture and some of the other diversions that we're seeing coming out of here. I'm not talking about exemptions from taxes for worthy causes or local governments or school buses or anything like that. I'm talking about straight shifts of money over to other agencies that are clearly not improvements on highways and bridges or safety, as noted in the Constitution Secretary Hassel mentioned. So that's sort of our introduction to the topic for the group. Thank you for your attention.
Really appreciate that, Bob. And I just must remain on the fast pace here because we have guests here to present to us. So I think that all of these presentations have begun to maybe carve out for us a sense of what we have to do next and really getting behind these things. But I think it's really important that we at least have our external guests from ARPA, from the Road and Transportation Builders Association, have a little bit of time because they have been kind enough to join us. So I am pleased to introduce Dr. Allison Black and Carolyn Kramer. So the Chief Economist, Dr. Black, and Carolyn, the Director of the Investment Advocacy Center. And I'm not sure who would like to start it off, but if you say next, I will advance the slides for you.
That's great. Thank you very much. Many thanks to the Secretary and the Commission for the opportunity to be here today. I'm Dr. Allison Black. I am Chief Economist with the American Road and Transportation Builders Association. And for those of you not familiar with ARPA, we are an association based in Washington, D.C. We have over 8,000 members across the country involved in all aspects of transportation. So that would include contractors, planning and design firms. We have state DOTs, local officials that are also members. So our goal is to really bring together all of the industry stakeholders. And about 8 years ago, we started what is called our Transportation Investment Advocacy Center, or TIAC for short. And you'll see the part of the body of work that we do there, really trying to study what states are doing to try and increase their own transportation revenues and how some of those best practices, those case studies, that information can be shared with groups like this and other state and local areas that are really trying to address those revenue issues. So if you don't mind going to the next slide, I'll get things started very briefly by just talking a little bit, and sorry, you can go one more, about why this is so important to the economy of Pennsylvania. And again, I know you've had presentations on this and other people will touch on this, but this is something that we really have looked at both for Pennsylvania and other states, but there are really two economic impacts. The first is just the short run impact of that actual construction activity. And in Pennsylvania, for every dollar of highway and bridge construction investment, there is a return of over $2.15 to the economy. And that is business output through all sectors, not just the construction industry. And that is actually one of the highest rates of return that we see for any state across the country. And what that means is that there are a lot of goods and services within Pennsylvania that are serving this industry. There's not as much that's being bought from neighboring states or other areas. So it really does have that short-term economic impact, jobs that are created, all of those things we talk about. The longer run benefits are a little bit harder to quantify, but there's a lot of economic work that's been done in this area. Some conservative estimates are that for every dollar invested, there's a return of about $4. And that comes through people spending less time in congestion. You have increases in business productivity. They have a wider, businesses can pull from a wider range of labor pools. They can have suppliers that travel longer distances. So again, that's a conservative estimate. There's been some work done by the US Treasury that for projects of very much a regional significance, that return can even get as high as $6, $7, or $8 for every dollar invested. So, you know, as you're talking about some of the investment needs and numbers, I think it's so important to remember that there is that very broad economic return that touches all citizens and businesses across the state. And the next slide, the opportunity cost is very real if these investments are not made. And just to put a few numbers on that, we've been working with some data from the Federal Highway Administration on the economic cost of freight bottlenecks. Across the country, that is $42 billion. In Pennsylvania alone, that is $1.2 billion. That is their estimate. And that comes largely from freight trucks sitting in traffic and congestion and the hours of delay. There are over 22 million hours that trucks are sitting in delay just on that highway network in Pennsylvania, that 22 million hours. So the next slide, I'm going to tee things up for my colleague, Carolyn Kramer. And you'll see here some of the work, some of the things that we've been tracking over time. As you will see, there has been a big shift in how states are funding their transportation programs. And what you're looking at here is, again, some data from the Federal Highway Administration. This is a national average, but it shows total revenue sources for state highway and bridge programs. This would include state DOTs as well as turnpike authorities. And you can see the shift just from 2000, the pie graph on the left. Motor fuel taxes were about 31% of all program revenues coming in. That has declined to 19%. And where we've seen significant growth is in other user fees, such as license fees, motor vehicle registration taxes. That has grown. We've also seen that other state revenue piece. So whether that's a sales tax on motor vehicle sales, a business tax, I saw that mentioned earlier in some of the comments. There are a wide variety of things that go into that piece of the pie, but we've seen that grow. And there's been an overall trend, as Carolyn will walk you through some of these details, of trying to diversify revenues. And we've seen a handful of states as well pass multiple revenue measures over a multi-year period. Their state legislatures have been very active in trying to address these issues, not just with one bill, but several pieces over the years. So the last slide I have, just again, some of the comments about the federal aid highway program. That is extremely important to state highway programs. What you're looking at here is a 10-year average. It's a ratio between federal reimbursements to state programs, and then what those states are spending on capital outlays. And you can see the average there is about 42% in Pennsylvania. Now, we do see these numbers change over time as states are trying to diversify that revenue stream so that they can add additional state funds to their capital programs. And that's going to include construction, right of way, and planning and design. But again, just a reminder of how those discussions in DC, as I've seen in some of the comments people have posted, very thoughtful about some of the potential increases there and how that would impact the situation in Pennsylvania. So with that, on the next slide, I will turn things over to my colleague, Carolyn, and happy to serve as a resource in the future. If there's time for questions today or later on, please feel free to contact us.
Thank you, Dr. Black.
Great, thanks, Allison. And I just want to thank the commission for inviting us to share our research. It's always such a wonderful opportunity to be able to share this information. So I've heard a lot of these trends brought up earlier in the call. Some things are going to be familiar to you guys. Some things will hopefully be new. And hopefully we'll have time for some questions as well. I'm going to start things off by talking about the state motor fuel tax increases we've tracked in the past 8 years. We've seen 31 states increase or adjust their motor fuel tax 32 times. So that is one of the trends we are seeing. I'm going to start off with that. States that have increased their gas taxes recently coming back to the board to reevaluate the formula or the flat fee and increase it or adjust it. And primarily when I say 31 states have done it 32 times, I'm talking about Virginia, which passed a motor fuel tax increase in 2013 along with Pennsylvania and came back last year to change that formula, which was originally based off the average wholesale price of fuel, and change that to index with inflation. And that is one of the other trends that we are seeing. So we've seen 32 state gas tax increases in the past 8 years, and half of those are variable rate formula. I'll go into more detail on that shortly, but that is something I like to flag on this slide as one of the trends that we are seeing. An additional trend that we do see are states that the timing of when states increase their gas tax. We often see them in odd numbered years. Looking back to 2013, only 5 of those state gas tax increases have happened during an even year. Most of them, 27, have occurred in odd number years. And there's a few reasons for that, primarily looking at that ebb and flow of legislative cycles and election years. So you see a lot of states have shortened or bridged or even skipped legislative cycles during an election year. And there's also a lot of energy that's spent on re-election campaigns, so we don't see them as often in even number years. And one more thing I would like to highlight before we move on to the next slide is the different ways that states are applying a gas tax increase. So we are increasingly seeing states phase in a gas tax increase over a number of years as a way to gradually introduce that to the population. We also have, there was in South Carolina, a creative formula in which they had the state gas tax increase that was approved be available to be refunded to residents when they filed their tax returns that year. And so that has come up as a topic of interest in many other states as a way, again, to get that, take advantage of the out-of-state travelers and tourists, but still make that something that's easy for residents to work with. So if you would like to advance to the next slide.
I will indeed, Carolyn. I would like to invite people to put their questions in chat. Because of the great information we received in the last segment, we're going to be very pressed for time. And I do have to be very respectful of the need for public comment from a legal perspective. So I'm really on the hook for that. What I'm asking you folks is we're squeezing you a little bit. And if you want to do a thorough job for the next 10 minutes or so, and we invite you back, which I know is probably an imposition, we could also have you field those questions and kind of pick up where we leave off, if that's at all possible. So,
of course.
Thank you.
To the next slide. I think this just came up in the chat, so I'm addressing a question early, and I'll try to keep these brief, but we are seeing an increase of interest in converting flat taxes, which is a cents per gallon paid at the pump, to a variable rate formula. And that formula adjust the state gas tax based off of external factors. I've listed the most common ones that we're seeing up top, but there are also a few creative solutions that we're seeing at the bottom of that list. Consumer price index as measured by inflation, that is increasingly becoming a more popular topic. We have 10 states that currently do that. Average wholesale price of fuel, you guys would be very familiar with that, Pennsylvania. Meeting a state's transportation fund needs. So there are 2 states, Nebraska and New Jersey, that permit them to automatically adjust the state gas tax amount based off of what the state's transportation funds are obligated to meet. In New Jersey, that's Department of Revenue. In Nebraska, I believe it's through the state legislature. So those are 2 different ways to ensure that they're getting what they need from the state gas tax. One state changes in population. So when population increases, the gas tax adjusts accordingly. Georgia has a multi-component gas tax that involves the corporate average fuel economy. So as vehicles become more fuel efficient, that adjusts. Alabama indexed their gas tax in 2019 to the National Highway Construction Cost Index, which is a measure of construction cost materials and production. If you'd like to advance to the next slide. And this is just a quick map just to show you what your neighbors are up to and what you're seeing across the country. We're going to keep moving along here, and we're going to go to the next slide. Electric vehicle fees. Now, this is a topic that's becoming increasingly interesting. As was mentioned earlier, the actual percentage of electric vehicle passenger vehicles is still quite low. One bill that was passed earlier this year, I believe that it was only going to raise in the first year something like $50,000. It's a very small amount of the overall picture, but as we expect the electric vehicles to become more cost effective to purchasing and to grow in popularity, we are seeing states kind of preemptively approve these electric vehicle fees as a way to anticipate that revenue in the future, and really as an equity to ensure that these drivers are still paying their fair share to use the roads. So we currently have 30 states that have an electric vehicle fee. That number has really skyrocketed in recent years. Prior to 2017, we only had 10 states that had an electric vehicle fee. It's really a very popular topic right now. In 2019, there were 8 states alone. Already in 2021, we've already seen 2 states that have gone ahead and approved fees, and we have 1 state that is currently pending the governor's signature. Most of these are annual fees. South Carolina is biennial, so every 2 years. Most states dedicate this revenue to transportation construction funding. There are a few exceptions. Alabama has a $200 fee, and $50 of that is used for new electric vehicle infrastructure. So there is a little bit of change, but most of it is dedicated to transportation funding. And at least 6 of these states, which is California, Indiana, Michigan, Mississippi, North Carolina, and Utah, structure these registration fees to grow over time, just like they would with a variable rate gas tax. All right, and the next slide, you can see a map of the fees across the country and what states have them. We can go to the next slide. Road usage charge programs and pilots. This is becoming an increasingly popular topic for me. We have seen a lot of states that have introduced pilot programs or studies or reports or task forces to investigate this option. Some states are very interested in it. Some states are very aware of the limitations within their own state. So it's very much right now, state by state, that interest. We do have 2 states that have moved beyond the pilot stage and have enacted some sort of program. I heard Oregon mentioned earlier. Oregon permits volunteers to opt into their program, and it allows drivers to have their miles monitored by various different ways, some that involve tracking devices in the car, some that involve self-reporting. It is still very much in an experimental phase. And it hasn't been extremely popular quite yet, but it is definitely something that is growing of interest in that state. And then in Utah, that is the most recent program that has come into fruition. In Utah, they permit electric vehicles or hybrid vehicles, either plug-in or gas hybrid vehicles, to opt into a road usage charge instead of paying their flat annual fee. And that road usage charge amount is capped at what they would pay for their flat annual fee. And this is kind of a way for the state to experiment with a road usage charge and see the interest that's involved in that and how usable it is throughout the state. In 2021, this year, there have been 6 studies that have been introduced, 5 proposals to have electric vehicles do their own road usage charge, just like Utah did. And 3, they're proposing implementing a pilot program. One study in Oklahoma, I believe, is currently pending the governor's signature. So we'll see if that gets approved. But it's definitely something that is becoming a topic of interest throughout the country. And we do have 2 different multi-state regional programs. We have the Western Road Usage Charge Consortium and the I-95 Corridor Coalition. Next slide. Okay, moving on to one-time revenues. This is definitely right now in this time in right now in history is very much a topic of interest with the low interest rates. We are seeing a lot of states looking to take advantage of that. Earlier this year, Massachusetts approved a $16.5 billion bond to be spread out over 10 years as part of their program. In Utah, we saw earlier this year a combination of bond and appropriations, and the bond part was done because of those low interest rates. And one-time revenues, we're seeing a lot of the federal relief money that's going to be allocated. We saw Ohio did $333 million from the December relief fund. There's a lot of proposals as well as how to use that one-time relief money. In Wisconsin, they're currently working between the legislature and the governor. The legislature is proposing using some of that money to retire their transportation bonds. So it's definitely seeing a lot of different ways to use that one-time revenue as a way to boost the program. There are a few states that don't permit any bonding, Iowa, Nebraska, South Dakota, Tennessee, and Wyoming. And there are 3 states, Idaho, Montana, and North Dakota, that only issue Garvey bonds. So it definitely varies. It definitely varies depending on the state and how they use those bonds. And go to the next slide. Now, this is the one that I've been rushing to get to. As Allison mentioned, we are seeing an increasing number of states that are exploring different ways to increase transportation funding outside of the traditional motor fuel tax as a way to vary their transportation funding program. As you can see here, in the past 3 years, we've seen 7 states approve recurring funding measures. Now, for this map, we do not include electric vehicle fees, road usage charges, motor fuel taxes, because we covered them earlier. This is our other recurring revenue map. And what I mean by other recurring revenues that we try to capture in that category: motor vehicle titling, licensing, registration, and fees like that, motor vehicle sales taxes, and sales on parts for motor vehicles. That is an increasingly growing, interesting topic. General sales taxes being used to fund transportation, tolls, ending diversions. Now, this came up earlier in Bob's statement, and that's definitely, as states look to increase their transportation funding through various methods, we are seeing states looking at where their transportation funds are currently being used and whether that's the best fit for that direct line of use versus pay versus use. And when I talk about that, Utah this year passed a bill that prohibits the state infrastructure bank revenue for the construction or improvement of parking facilities. So that takes that out. In 2019, Idaho removed law enforcement from their state highway funds. So that's definitely a topic of interest that has been growing as states look to streamline their transportation funding. Local and regional taxes and fees is also another topic of interest. And I saw a question earlier about how various states do it. And it really, the sky is the limit on on what states permit for locals. Some states permit very little to none. So a lot of states will permit local funding through a ballot measure. And on our website, we do track those local ballot measures. We've seen over 2,000 local ballot measures in the past 10 years. Majority of them are property taxes. You'll see states like Michigan and Ohio that permit localities, towns, townships, counties, or cities to implement property or income taxes. And so quite a few of our measures are from states like that permit all of them. And then we have places like New York, where the legislature has permitted New York City to implement congestion fee pricing. And that is still in development, but that is scheduled to go into effect in the next couple of years. And that would be a New York City specific fee, something that is definitely becoming a topic of interest in states with other large urban areas. And rideshare fees is another way that states have been using recent technological developments in order to, seize on that and make sure those are paying their fair share. So rideshare fees and self-driving vehicles. And we also have in the past, I think I see Allison put that in there actually. Hotel fees, Georgia permitting hotel fees for transportation funding purposes. That was out of their 2015 legislation. And that was actually just this year constitutionally dedicated as well. So it can't be diverted to any other purposes. Oregon has a charge based off of vehicles' gas mileage. And they also have a 0.1% state payroll tax that's used to fund mass transit. I've seen sin taxes mentioned earlier in this call, and we see states that have sin taxes on gambling, sports betting, cigarette tax in Indiana, and those are being used to fund transportation construction. In Virginia, the internet sales tax is used for transportation purposes. That came out of their 2013 bill. And finally, no, I'm going to cut myself off there.
Carolyn, I really do appreciate your getting to this culminating slide, and I apologize for the rush, but we actually said it would be a good problem to have if we had a lot of input in our previous session. Not a good problem for you. I have your PowerPoint. I believe it has notes as well. Are you okay with our sharing those notes?
Let me clean those up a little bit because those are very stream of consciousness, and I'll send you guys that you can share.
Well, you have a tremendous stream of consciousness. We appreciate that. Thank you for being conscious of that. Thank you, Dr. Black. But I do have to be respectful of the opportunity for public comment. So I simply want to invite anyone who is from the public who is connected by phone only to unmute. I believe you got a message on how to do that, but I believe it's a *6 and chat with us because I'm right up against it, meaning I'm a minute over right now. Hearing none, and with a sigh of relief, I'm going to provide a look ahead that we will have a multimodal presentation on the 13th with Jen Granger. We will move into an MBUF presentation formally on the 27th. I may have characterized today's as MBUF, but it was much broader, as you understand. And then we really, I think, have locked in on an opportunity here with the foundations of understanding that we were really helped to by our rather informal work groups that arose. So with that, Secretary, I know what that picture means. It means we get to see the real you and hear from you as well.
Okay.
There you go.
Thank you. Great session today, Paul. Thank you. Thank you, all the presenters, all the commission members. I really appreciate all the information that was being shared and your active participation today. Today is the last day of April. Actually, one before last day. Tomorrow is going to be the last day of April. And as we move into the month of May, our work will continue to take shape, will intensify on several fronts. As a commission with over 40 members, we have a tremendous opportunity before us to be stewards for Pennsylvania's transportation mobility and access for decades to come. We will continue to make significant progress over the next 30 days. I look forward to our interactions before our next meeting on May 13th. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. Thanks again. Have a great day. And again, thank you for all the participation and the good comments. Back to you, Paul.
Yes, thank you much, folks. And thanks for indeed working within our rather compressed time scale overall. And I guess it's only fitting that our meetings would be pressed as well. But I know people get booked up back to back in this virtual world. So greatly appreciate all our presenters. Those of you I really pushed and rushed. I apologize. That's the way I am. But for the greater good, we will have you back. So it's starting to take shape for us. So signing off. Yes.
Paul, it's Ken McLean. I do have one important announcement to make. I know we ran out of time today and we did not have the opportunity to give an update on the planning and environmental linkages study, but I do have one important update to share with everyone. Today, obviously, is April 29th. We will be releasing today for the first time the draft Pell report for public comment. We did have one round of public comment back in mid-November through mid-December. So today, you know, after the last couple months of hard work on that Pell, we do have a draft document. It's being released today for a 30-day public comment period. We're hoping that we do receive robust comments related to the Pell. The Pell stands for Planning and Environmental Linkages document. It is a study that is used to identify alternate funding transportation programs and efforts that we're going to be looking at PennDOT as we move forward. So in that Pell document and on our website, you can find all of the information related to each of those individual 6 or 7 different scenarios for alternate funding. Many of them do include user fees, implementations of user fees. You know, MBUF is in there, a couple things that we talked about today, corridor pricing, you know, the bridge tolling is a component of that, and a couple other projects such as managed lanes. So I encourage everybody to look at www.penndot.gov/funding, and you can find all the information related to the Pell. There is a virtual public meeting platform out there on that website for people to get familiarized with all of the different options, alternative funding options we will be considering. You can, on the website, submit your comment via the website form. You can also submit an email comment. That would be penndotpathways@pa.gov. So if you'd like to submit a comment related to the Pell in the email, that's the email. And then for those that don't have broadband access or computers at home, you can leave a voice message that will be transcribed and recorded to a hotline number. And that number is 717-325-6129. And then I would suggest carrying the Pell conversation over to the next meeting for the T-Rock, if we have room on the agenda, to give a detailed description of what we'll be looking at for the benefit of the commissioners on the call. And that's all I have.
Great, Ken. Ken got squeezed out, and thank you for being a good sport about that. We will provide his PowerPoint presentation, and with that, we'll make sure that you have the backslashes and the dots and the phone numbers all when we put that out. And we won't wait for the minutes to the point that was up there. Patricia, we'll get it out even quicker than that. So thank you very much. Yeah, thanks, Ken. And with that, we're signing off. Thank you all.